And we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of HR Leaders Live. I'm Chris Rainey, founder and CEO here at HR Leaders, and I'll be your host as always. I'm joined by my co-host and partner in crime, Matt Burns, who's a former HR executive and host of the Thinking Inside the Box podcast. He's also the global industry analyst here at HR Leaders. We've got an amazing guest just joining us. We've got Dr. Veldsman, who's an award-winning psychologist and HR executive who currently serves as a chief scientist for HR and OD at AIHR. Welcome to the show. How are you? Nice to see you, my friends.
Oh, doing very well, thanks. Hi, Chris. Hi, Matt. Lovely to see you again.
I feel like that's a lot of pressure, Disa, when you say to someone that you're a chief scientist. How do you describe your job to people? Like, you're a chief scientist. What does that involve?
Well, I think unfortunately the first connotation they make is to those old cartoons of the mad scientist running around throwing different potions into the bowl. But practically on a day-to-day point of view, it just means I look after the thought leadership work at AIHR, and I look after a lot of our strategic clients to help them with some of their development journeys. But yeah, I prefer the crazy potion in the bowl type of imagery.
Go for that one. Before we go any further, go a bit back further for us. Tell everyone a little bit more about your journey to where we are now, because that would really help for everyone.
Yeah, sure. So from a background point of view, very passionate, sometimes over enthusiastic HR professional. So I have a background in organizational psychology. Started out in the corporate world working in organizational design and organizational development. From there, moved into consulting, had my own HR consulting business for 5 years. After that, we founded an HR technology business, one of my previous business partners, where we built employee engagement and leadership apps and software and applications. After which I worked in mergers and acquisitions, kind of looking at the people, human factor integration piece that had to come right after the deal was signed. I returned to corporate after that. So first as the people effectiveness executive, and then after that, the group HR executive looking after for a multinational insurance business, looking after their operations in Africa, the UK, and Asia. And about 2 years ago, I joined the academy in this kind of the chief scientist role that you've previously mentioned. Yeah, you also mentioned earlier, I am a closet academic as well. So I do guest lecture and I am involved in quite a few research kind of projects and try to always blend what's happening in the real world and, what we talk about in academia.
Yeah. Is there anything you haven't done yet? What's on the bucket list? What's left from that point of view?
There's still a couple of things. There's still a couple of things left there as well. So I've been fortunate to have some interesting challenges that I was able to get my teeth into.
Yeah, and tell everyone a little bit more quickly just about AIHR and the work that you do there.
Yeah, so we're a upskilling digital platform. So we believe, how do we help to prepare the HR professional for the future? So how do we look at what are some of the new skill sets that need to be developed? And as part of that, we've got an online community where we provide, anything from courses to live events to articles, research, podcasts to really prepare the HR professional for a future where we believe HR has got a very big role to play.
Amazing. Well, that AI in the HR is definitely coming into you were there a long time before everyone else from that perspective. So thanks for joining us, appreciate it, and we're going to love to hear your insights and perspectives. Matt, what's been in the news this week? What are we going to be chatting about today?
Oh, I'm excited for this conversation. You and I were talking about it offline. Really interesting conversation regarding farmers insurance and a decision the organization made to originally during the pandemic to allow remote work, and then apparently doing an about face and now telling employees that they're going to move to a hybrid work model. And employees aren't very happy about it, Chris. There was some expectations that were set either implicitly or explicitly in the organization. People picked up, moved their families, have obviously adjusted their lives to fit a different work model. And now with the move back to hybrid and in some cases returning to the office 3 days a week, there's been a real friction point. We've seen it now in multiple news outlets. I expect to hear more of this going forward as organizations continue to shift the way that they work and try and find the balance that works for them.
Yeah, and just for context for people that don't know the organization, they're in 50 states, 48,000 independent agents, 21,000 employees. So we're not talking about a small number of leaders. Disa, you've led this from both perspectives as a HR leader, from the consulting side. What are your thoughts?
I think the first thing that really jumps to mind for me, and I agree with Matt, I think we're going to see a lot more of these stories where organizations are trying to find that balance. But specifically for this one, I think there was three main ideas that really jumped out looking at the story. And the first one is, I think we still confuse presence with productivity. And there's a big movement and a very big conversation to say, if you're not present, you are not productive, or for you, in order to be productive, I need to see you a lot more and I want you to be present. And I think the employee side of that is they're saying, but, if you give me autonomy and choice and you trusted me to work remotely for up to now, what has changed? What is now different? And I think that's kind of the first, big kind of thing that just jumps out that we will have to really look at. I think the second one is, what I'm really interested in is the type of reasons that companies give employees as to why they are reversing the decision. A lot of them talk about, career development. They talk about training. We want people to be together a lot more. Mostly that is almost promoted as a bit of a public relations sell to the employees. The question I sometimes ask is, where's your data that backs that up, that's going to be better in person? Because there are certain practices that hold a bit of water, but you're going to have to say, this is the reasons why we want people to come back, and this is our stance, and this is our view as an organization. And then my last point there that jumps out, especially in the insurance industry, where you're sitting with such critical skills like actuarial skills and scarce skills such as digital skills, I'm wondering if there's not going to be a huge implication on their ability to attract top talent, especially in a tight labor market where talent will go elsewhere and say, but, I don't have to be here. I do have other options that fits better with how I want my career and my life to fit together. And, I think that's kind of key things that jump out for me that I think organizations need to start thinking about and solving for, especially when they now go back on previous agreements and arrangements that they had with their employees.
Do you think
so, Dieter, I'm interested in your thoughts on this as well. I mean, I think for me, I'm interested in the psychological safety element of this. So we talk about employees, you talk about a large workforce, a conversation's had. I'm assuming that there were some conversations throughout the pandemic with this employee base around financial performance, operational excellence, customer service. All these things are being talked about on an ongoing basis. And then seemingly with the change in leadership, and this seems to be from the outside at least, the shift in decision-making is tied to the shift in the CEO, who has a different opinion than the previous CEO of the organization. He believes that, to your point, collaboration, learning and development, culture is better served in an in-person environment. What does it do for the psychological safety of the employee base when an organization makes a pretty dramatic shift and it's seemingly without consultation?
And that last piece that you mentioned, Matt, is the piece that I'm worried about most. Let's say without consultation piece, because I think that will create the impression with the employee to say, what other decisions are you not speaking to me about? My voice is not being heard. I don't really feel as if I'm valued, as if I matter. And then what comes next in terms of what are you hiding from me as an organization that you are not openly sharing? So I sometimes wonder in these debates whether we shouldn't focus a lot more on the process of consultation and implementation and how this came to be, as opposed to just what the end decision is. And, that's the piece where I think you either break psychological safety or you actually get the trust of employees through the consultative process that you have followed as part of that. The second point that you make, and it is from the outside that I'm making this comment, I think there's a lesson for leaders here as well in terms of saying, immediately when you get into a new role or you move into a new role, sometimes it's worth it just really understanding the history of what has led to the decisions in terms of what they are today, as opposed to immediately just jumping in terms of your own beliefs and saying, yeah, we need to change direction. So the psychological safety component, for me, it's like a bank account. You deposit goodwill into it as an organization, as an employee. And when you make some rash decisions, you're actually withdrawing out of that bank account. And, my personal view is I think the bank account took quite a knock with that decision from the outside. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
hard.
hard.
I think you're right. And I think it's going to be an interesting conversation too around talent attraction going forward. This kind of stories do not help. I think about the recruitment team. They're probably pulling their hair out right now saying, how do we explain this to candidates that are in pipeline? How do line managers explain this in stay conversations with employees that may be suffering with engagement challenges? It's a decision that was seemingly made. And let's be fair, we're talking about a CEO, but that decision was not made by a singular individual. That would have had to have been done by an executive team. Dieter, you've been at the boardroom table now for years, both as a consultant, but also as an executive. Maybe give us a bit of a background view. What does those conversations look like at that boardroom table? As we're having conversations around hybrid work, remote work, structures of work, what does that discussion look like? And what traditionally in your experience has the role of HR been in those conversations?
Yeah, very good question, Matt. I think the role of HR, especially in some of these newer conversations pertaining to what work is going to look like, remote work is what we are talking about today, but it might as well have been, in terms of what AI is going to do to jobs in future or what work is going to look like. I think the role that HR needs to play around that boardroom table is to say, what are the assumptions that we are making? What evidence and data can we gather to actually go and test whether what we believe and the conversation that we're having in the boardroom, what is that based on? And then from there to say, how do we sketch different scenarios? And to make that practical, I sometimes think we make knee-jerk decisions around an executive table without really understanding the downstream implications and consequences of what that means, going down further into the organization. So these things are always compromising in terms of how do I weigh up risk versus reward? For me, I think HR plays a role of saying, how do we restore that sense of calm? How do we think through this? And how do we bring the insight into the boardroom that the people making that decision is not the majority of your workforce? Because that's something that I've always tried to really bring to the fore, is to say the 12, 14, 15 people that sits around your executive table, they actually do not represent the majority of the work life and the work experience of most of your workforce. So as HR, can you come in and really say, what's the real problem here? How do we describe that through evidence and data? And what is the action that we need to take? And then what is the pros and cons of the decisions that we make? Because every decision will have consequences. There's no such thing as something that is the golden standard that says that this is the decision we need to make. So I think HR almost plays that mediator role in a lot of these conversations, but you have to be able to back up what you want to bring to the table.
Yeah, it must be difficult though that you've made that decision, you've rolled that out as a HR team, then you've got a new CEO coming in saying, I'm gonna just ignore all of the feedback, all of the data, and we're gonna go in this direction. What do you do? How do you react, and what do you do? I'm sure you've both been in positions like that before where you disagree. What does that normally look like? To give us an inside look of what normally happens. You just kind of have to just say okay and bow out and just step back. I've made my point. What does that look like?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, and Matt, then please also, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think something there is you also have to acknowledge that there might not be an existing relationship yet between whoever's heading up HR and the new leader coming in. And you have to also acknowledge the fact that that relationship still needs to be built. So there's not yet mutual trust that sits within that relationship. So for me there, it's very much about how do you go about handling that issue, because it's okay to disagree, but you also need to start saying, how can I use this situation to almost align myself better with, the CEO, whoever the new leader is, so that we can work collaboratively and together in future. I do believe, with some of these, you're going to have to say, I might have to lose a couple of battles to win the broader war, but you're going to have to weigh up, what are you giving? Where are you going to kind of, compromise a little bit? And is it worth fighting some of these things? In terms of the conversation we're having today, I think that's a battle worth fighting, that conversation, because it's going to have a significant impact on your workforce.
And it's an impact that's going to affect ultimately the HR mandate for which the CHRO is going to be held accountable. So, Chris, I think I've seen, and Dieter can speak to this as well, I've seen a fundamental shift in the relationship between the HR executive and the CEO and the board over the 20 years I've been in business. When I first started, HR was given a list of things to do and an expectation these were done by this date, and that was the role. And there really wasn't a lot of space for pushback. And frankly, a lot of CEOs of that era didn't really view HR as a strategic function. HR was personnel, and therefore were responsible for handling functions and tasks that, in a lot of cases, other senior leaders just simply couldn't be bothered to do. Over the course of the maturity of the organization, HR has taken on a much more prominent role, thankfully, and the pandemic certainly shone a light on that in many organizations where HR leaders became a critical part of the management team. And as a consequence of that, they became critical parts of the conversation, because we understand now that in a human capital oriented structure, and we're moving into an era right now, Chris, we have this conversation, I think, on every podcast. Demographics are changing in most jurisdictions around the world. With the exception of the Middle East and North Africa, every other jurisdiction is rapidly aging. And as a consequence of that, the idea of workforce being an exploitable, easily replaceable asset is over. And as a consequence of that, we have to think more broadly about how do we invest in, upskill, and retain our workforce, meaning we have to consult them in a way we may not have been comfortable in doing so before. Now, as far as this conversation is concerned, I might be a bit of an outlier. I often went to bat and had tough conversations with my senior leadership team, sometimes at the detriment of my career. And I've left at least one job as a consequence of a conversation that wasn't able to be resolved. And I feel good about that decision, but it wasn't an easy decision, because when you have to turn your back on your team or an organization or a comfortable role and salary, that's the ultimate sacrifice that you have to make as an executive. But ultimately, in some cases, to Dieter's point, it might be the right call. I think in cases where it doesn't get to that extreme, one thing I've always leaned upon is trying to understand what's the driving force behind the decision. So in this case, I would be curious to understand, why does the CEO believe that working 3 days a week is the right decision to achieve the stated outcomes? Because to Dieter's earlier point, my personal bias is that if we move towards a performance management model that's outcome-based, the time and the location of the work is irrelevant. Rather, did you do the outcomes that were set out for you in your goals, or did you not do them? And whether you did them in your cubicle at the office or on a beach in Maui, it really doesn't matter to me as long as the outcomes are based. Now, that's my personal view. Other individuals feel differently and feel that there's opportunities and things that you can lose by being in the office. I don't disagree. But then to set an arbitrary standard that 3 days a week is the standard, to me, it goes beyond simple collaboration. You can address collaboration challenges by scheduling quarterly meetings with your team to come into the office, or monthly meetings to the team to come in the office. Or I wonder how the organization solves with the fact that we mentioned earlier, they're in 50 states. I'm willing to bet they have a lot of conference calls and webinars and Zoom calls
Anyway.
where people are already working offsite. So it makes the argument less compelling than if you're in a startup environment where you have 6 people in an office versus if you are 50,000 people spread all over the United States. So all those things conspire to me to create some distrust with the actual kind of corporate spin messaging. I'd want to understand what's driving the CEO's perspective, and can we unravel that to give him more comfort around a model that seems a bit more balanced, so we can address the concerns around collaboration, innovation, operational excellence, while still looking after your employees. It doesn't have to be binary, but I fear that if we don't consult people, it does become a binary conversation.
If I can add to that, Matt, the one thing that, I've always found, and I think you've mentioned that, is that context matters, but you do have to spend the time to really understand what are we really trying to solve for? Because very often the conversation that happens at the surface level is not the underlying root cause of what you are trying to solve for in the organization. So, we're talking about bringing people back to the office, but there could potentially be a deeper seated conversation there that needs to be held around, whether that is lack of performance or whether that is the changing demographic, etc. So I do think it is worth it spending the time to deep dive a little bit into around what is the real issue that we are trying to address, because then the solution could potentially look very different, as you've rightfully said. In terms of the role of HR, I just want to agree with you on that. I think there's also, I'm sharing this anecdotally. A CHRO colleague mentioned the other day that, pre-pandemic, the conversation was all around the seat at the table and being invited, etc. She's now having the conversation to say, I no longer want to be invited to all the seats at all the different tables. That's changed quite a bit, and the view has changed and the perspective has changed. But I think HR professionals, especially CHROs, still need to step kind of into that role and authorize themselves around what does this new role and contribution look like, because it is different and it is more at a macro, almost external level for me at times as well.
Yeah. You mentioned, Matt, about what you'd be interested to hear what he said, and it was, the quote in the article. He said they need to do that for better collaboration, creativity, and innovation. That was the 3 things that kept coming up, and I feel like we're starting to use this as an excuse not to do it, because let's face it, it's hard. No one's saying it, and it's a lot more easier just to default back to what we already know and do, as opposed to actually do the work, be intentional. It's not going to be easy, but we proved during the pandemic, and many companies before that, companies like GitHub, who 100% remote, who have amazing case studies, they can prove it can be done, but it takes hard work and time to do it. So I feel like everyone's using those things, we can't collaborate, we can't create, we can't innovate, as an excuse not to put the work in. Would you agree with that?
Well, and yeah, I agree. I think and Dieter's mentioned a couple of times, context is important. And I'm not going to dump on the entire industry, but the insurance industry is not really known for innovation, traditionally speaking. Like by extension of it, like the group is balanced on measuring and managing towards risk. Like, we're not talking about SpaceX here. We're talking about an insurance organization. So not only does the new model require a different way of working, it requires a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of the organization.
That's true.
In a remote, dispersed world, people are much more collaborative, and it's much more of a flat organizational structure where people work hand in hand, and there isn't necessarily the hierarchical views. In this model, This feels very much like a hierarchical decision that's coming from the top down. And while I respect the CEO's opinion, I think we all can appreciate that that quote didn't come from the CEO, but rather PR wrote that for the CEO,
sorry. Yeah,
and he
I should say that.
messaged
Yeah.
it. And that's the same refrain that's come up every single time every other organization mentions it. So it's starting to sound a little bit like white noise, because it's not really anchored in any evidence. It's not anchored in specifics, nor is it speaks to the root cause of the opportunity. So it feels a lot more like an issue of convenience and how do you sell this. Whereas I think to Dieter's earlier point, I'd be interested to see, did they do a survey? Was there an employee sentiment that was assessed? And if so, what was the sentiment around employee survey? If the survey said we're struggling with collaboration and team cohesion and turnovers increasing, there could be a very strong business case to make a move back, at least part-time, to the office that I'm completely acceptable with. But again, this is a decision around personal interest. I've spent too long around boardroom tables where when you're making a case for change, they ask you for data. But when they want a case for change, they don't really want to see the data. So that's where, again, I don't know the situation. We obviously aren't at the boardroom table in this conversation, but I'd be curious to find out, was it an evidence-based decision, or is it based on a historical precedent that's been set and a desire to return back to the good old days, where in reality is what got us to this point isn't going to get us to success in the future, because the conditions have changed demographically, environmentally, and just more broadly societally.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder, Matt, it's just to your point, I sometimes think it's easy to work remotely, but a lot of people can't lead remotely. Because I think a lot of these conversations actually come from a point of the discomfort and the insecurity around what is my team? Where are they? What are they doing? Am I in control? Do I feel in control? And to your point, those are all, perceptions, and it's based on doing the work, Chris, to your point about transitioning towards this new way of work, because going virtual is not working digitally. It's not the same thing. And a lot of people have assumed that we can keep on doing things in the same way, just doing it via screen as opposed to doing it in person. You have to foster new habits. You have to foster new ways of connection. And to your point, it has to be based on trust and trusting people to actually do what they said they were going to, and then measuring the outcomes and dealing with it from that perspective and that point of view. So very interesting for me how that power dynamic is definitely going to shift, and I think rebalance. And I think a lot of people are going to learn some critical lessons through this process, of what talent in this new way of work actually values from an employee-employee relationship point of view.
It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, it's easy to infer as well. And again, we're painting with broad strokes here, but it's easy to infer what some of the decisions could be. I've never sat as a CEO of a large insurance organization, but I have sat in as an executive, and I understand the pressure that goes along with being a publicly traded company where you're held to quarterly earnings statements. And if I'm trying to make a good first impression, what I'm generally going to do is look for things that make me the most comfortable in the ways that I've had success in the past. Yeah. And that in the HR context looks like making sure your executive team, and you see this a lot, Dieter, in organizations, they flip out executive team members, people they've worked with in the past, because there's comfort, there's confidence, there's familiarity. I know I can trust Dieter as the CFO to execute this process. So even though the existing CFO may be a very high-performing individual, I am going to be held to the standard of our share price. And as a consequence, I don't want to take any risk with that. I'm going to make some talent decisions. The next thing is decisions like this. How do we work? Where do we work? How does the work take place? Because ultimately, he will be measured by the success and or lack of success financially of the organization. If there's a giant revolt of the employees and their turnover spikes over the next couple of years, but they deliver strong financial performance as it relates to their share price, this will be heralded as the right decision, because that's the measures in which he is basing his decisions on, because that's the one he's held accountable to. It's what he's compensated against. And it's how, unfortunately, in our current model in publicly traded companies, that is the sole duty of an executive team, their fiduciary responsibility, as it were, is to raise shareholder value. And these consequences of addressing employees, while for us is good cannon fodder, if the share price continues to creep up and climb, this will be heralded again as a really good decision. So I think context, to your point, is really, really important. He may understand this might drive turnover. HR may have said this is going to spike turnover. It's going to be bad for press, but they can weather the storm and come through the other side of this with a stronger share price, stronger financial performance, then that's the model other organizations will inevitably follow.
It's an interesting point you made there, Matt, because are we even incentivizing and encouraging the right behaviors from our leaders? If you're right, if he's incentivized that way, he's going to make decisions based on that. which makes so it's almost like we've changed the way we're working, but the way we reward and recognize success hasn't evolved along with it, and it will just continue to be the same until then. It's similar with just line managers. If you're rewarding them on specific outcomes and they're not based on remote ways of working, then what a surprise, they're not going to really want to do it as well. Because but if you're holding them accountable and redesigning that, then you're going to get the behaviors that you want to drive, because they're going to be really incentivized both personally and financially to do so. Let's not pick on them too much longer, because I feel like we're just for those that organizations that are bringing people back into the workplace, what can they do to make the workplace more desirable and more fulfilling for employees?
So I think the first thing, Chris, is organizations also need to realize that they can't be everything for everyone. And if you're trying to do that, you're going to end up not having a value proposition that anybody actually can attach to and that anybody can buy into. And I start with that statement because I think the easy answer here to say is, relook EVPs, relook employee experience, but I don't think it is as easy as that. I think the question goes, as an organization, rather ask the question, what type of employer do we want to be? That has to be based on to say, what type of workforce do we have and do we want to attract? To Matt's earlier point, the workforce demographic is also changing quite significantly. Deep dive into that a bit more so that you really understand what are the needs that the workforce that you want to attract actually has out of the employment relationship. And as an employer, what are you willing to stand for in terms of what you want to be known for as an employer? I had a executive that used to work with me that always said, what is it that's going to make us famous? But you can't be famous for everything. What are those 2 or 3 things that's really going to be important? I want to come back to Matt's earlier point just on trust, because you can only do this if you establish a relationship of trust, when bringing people back through that particular process. And then really start aligning. For me, there's 3 practices in HR that we don't do well to align. The first one is employer brand. What is it that we really promise and can we back it up? Our employee value proposition, in the sense that do we have an offering that speaks to the promise, and then the experience and the way that we actually deliver that to employees. So kind of those 3, can I call them the 3 E's, need to be congruent. For me, also important is then people need to decide. So when we're saying we're in an era of autonomy and choice, I need to be able to understand. So let's say I do join an organization that is very clear about the fact that they believe 5 days in the office, remote working flexibility is not something that we can offer as an organization. If I knew that and I said yes to it, I think it's a different conversation pertaining to the fact, it kind of changed midway, or, our talent acquisition colleagues with a lot of love and respect sold flexibility as a key benefit, of the employment relationship. So long-winded answer, but to come back to your question, for me, it's about being very clear around what you can offer, what you want to offer, and then being very clear to understand who is your workforce from a human point of view and tying that into the relationship and to start building it from there.
Maybe blending that answer with the previous question around incentives. I think as you think about the role of a CHRO, the role of an advocate, it's a tough job these days. You're consistently advocating for both employee interest and broader organizational interest, and sometimes those things come in conflict with one another. So I think what I would add is, again, back to our consistent theme of this conversation around context, insurance organizations operate from a mantra of risk. They're trying to mitigate risk is the general process. And if we present evidence that demonstrates the risk of decisions, in this case, the decision to step away from the office or step back into the office or step away from the office, understanding the considerations that go into that, things like talent attraction, talent retention, upskilling and skills retention, all those things should be part of the broader conversation so that we understand the implications of our decisions. Because ultimately, while we may lament the fact that incentives in most publicly traded organizations are solely financial, the fact of the matter is all those considerations I just mentioned have a financial implication to them. So if we can translate those, a turnover conversation into a time to fill conversation, a cost of attrition conversation, a skills, continuity conversation, and we can make that argument in a more financially compelling, risk-oriented way, that's the way we're going to be able to move this agenda forward versus, again, trying to hypothesize in terms of what's the driving factor behind this. This is the job of HR now. We have to be technologists, financial experts, cultural experts, and be able to translate the language across all of those groups in order to be able to present compelling cases that, again, both meet the needs of the organization and meet the needs of the employees. It's a really difficult job. I do not envy today's HR leaders.
Should we end it there then? Bye. Matt, is there anything we missed that you wanted to add? I think we covered it. We pretty much.
I think this is the reason why we do this show, Chris. I mean, thank you again to Dieter for joining us. We want to bring people on the show that bring broad perspective, that have sat at the proverbial boardroom tables, who've had those conversations. These are questions that HR leaders are having within their smaller groups today, right now, which is why we consistently get people reaching out to us on LinkedIn. They come to events, they listen to the podcast. These are not easy questions to solve for. I think this is a great platform to have these conversations and at least move the agenda forward. And I would just add, for anybody who's listened to this conversation, who has a question or they have a lingering thought, just reach out. I'm happy to answer questions on LinkedIn. I know Dieter and Chris, you are as well. We're happy to support people because ultimately we're in service to the people that we work with, and we understand the significant role HR has in playing that.
Yeah, amazing. Well, on that point, thanks so much, Lisa, for coming on. I appreciate it. And everyone, make sure you go check out AIHR, check out their podcast, their YouTube channel, the website. Make sure you follow Lisa on LinkedIn there. As always, you can follow, if you're not connected, me and Matt would love to connect with you. And make sure you hit that bell icon. I keep saying it on LinkedIn. If you hit the bell icon, it's a new feature on LinkedIn on our profiles. That way you'll be notified when we post new content and when we go live. So you can catch up on demand. Apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you all next week. Bye, everyone. See you later. Bye.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.